Alrighty. How are we all tonight? We doing good? We having a good time? Can everybody hear me? Do I sound okay? I mean, so far this microphone's been working out pretty well, but you never know. Exhausted as fuck, clear as mud. Oh, fair. So it has been a big couple weeks. You have Donald Trump running rampant. More importantly, you have Elon Musk running rampant. Apparently sticking external hard drives into secured systems, because that's never a bad thing. I'm sure that won't result in something bad happening to the American people at all. You've got Donald Trump running protectionist schemes again, seemingly trying to throw the country back into the 18th century. And to top it all off, we're having some upheavals here closer to home on YouTube, aren't we? Obviously, the Destiny thing has grown in size and scope, as it turns out that he's even using these leaks now to try to engage other women in sexual activity. So he's clearly learned nothing at all. And that's after some of his compatriots got up and said, I'm sure he's very remorseful. Well done. Good job, Destiny. Then obviously, if you're a member of this community and our associated overlapping community, you understand the fucked up week we've had. We're not really going to talk about that. I have a rule where I try not to do a thing when I'm mad, and I'm mad. So we're going to talk about other things today. Yesterday, Donald Trump decided to announce that he is imposing a number of tariffs on countries, including the European Union, China, Canada, and Mexico. You'll note that that basically covers most of our principal trading partners. And while I'm pretty sure you guys know what a tariff is, talk about it a little bit because it's my show and I get to do what I want. A tariff is a tax placed on an imported good designed in part to encourage the consumption of domestically produced goods. Remember that one time when Trump ordered water reserves in California to be dumped? Yes, that was another bit of bullshit. So tariffs are not really used that often anymore. They were a very big staple of economic theory for nationalism in the 16th and 17th centuries. And the prevailing thought at the time was something that had come to be called mercantilism. And it was named that by, I believe, Adam Smith, who sort of elucidated this system and argued for free markets, or at least his envisionment of free markets in the wealth of nations. And mercantilism is this concept that a nation's economic strength grows when the nation maintains a favorable balance of trade. So the idea is that you hoover up resources as a nation, you hoover up gold as a nation, and you work to ensure that you are exporting more goods than you are importing. And a principal method to discourage imports is to make them more expensive. And this is what a tariff was used for. They were designed to make it so it was not impossible, but much more beneficial to buy goods that came into a nation and produced there instead of those that were imported from another country. And there's this like very interesting set of relationships that comes out of this economic theory, right? Because we'll note that we're talking about the 16th, 17th, and at least part of the 18th century. We're talking about a period where colonialism is very big, and obviously colonies were being founded well before that. But like this idea of having these overseas bases in turn made it possible to have a captive market for exports. So yeah, Stephanie's right. The Boston Tea Party happened because of a tariff on Dutch tea. Uh, the point, though, is that the idea is that the American colonies were subject to having to get their resources from the British, and therefore this counts as an export for the British. A lot of cases, colonies aren't exactly on paper profitable. And they're maintained principally because they want to be able to build out this economic growth through exports. Tariffs are considered today to be kind of, even amongst economists, to be bad. What they tend to do is to encourage competition and conflict instead of like economic competition. A lot of the wars that we talk about prior to the founding of the United States, the French and Indian War, or as it's called more broadly, the 7-Day or the 7-Year War, for example, is very much built around the ability to control trade and exports. They also don't really allow for economic growth. They're inhibited to it, and it's functionally a tax on the poorest people in a country. Because a tariff is placed on a good. So suppose you're importing widgets and there's a tariff on widgets. It's a 25% tariff. So 25% of the cost of the widget you pay in a tax. That cost is then passed on to whoever you are selling the widgets to. If you are a wholesaler selling widgets to someone who uses widgets to produce a thing, then you're going to pass on the cost of that material input to the producer, who then has to buy it at that increased cost and raise their own prices in order to protect their profit margin. Or if you are, in fact, the kind of a much more rare situation, because a lot of this is handled by companies that specifically deal with imports, import export type situations. But a much more rare situation would be you are the end user of the widget yourself, importing the widget for yourself, and it is an input in a product that you make. Again, you raise the price of the product to cover the cost of the tariff. Tariffs are not principally paid by the other country. It's a chain of cause and effect. Tariff is imposed on the good is more expensive for them to send to the country, therefore it's more expensive for you, the buyer, and it becomes more expensive for the people down the line. Since the end goal of most products is to be purchased by people, the people who do the purchasing of the product are the ones who pay the tariff in the end. So this is a interesting situation. I can't stay on Twitter that long anymore, to be perfectly frank. It's full of stupid people, and they make me sad. But the trouble is that a lot of people are trying to argue that a tariff is not a tax increase. And I suppose, technically, a tariff isn't a tax increase, but it serves to be one functionally. And more to the point, it seems that many people in Trump's little media ecosystem don't seem to understand that they will be the ones who end up paying the tariff. Particularly when you take into account the nature of our economy now these days. Um, Trade has always been a vital part of economic activity throughout most of human history. But the level of interdependence that we have with one another on trade as nations is more than it has ever been in our history. We are not a net producer of many of the goods we use. A lot of them are imported. This is going to hit people uh, very hard, particularly in those kinds of areas that are typically strong Trump supporting areas. For example, a lot of the goods that you will purchase in a big box store, such as Walmart or Target, are imported. Not all of them, but a lot. And there are places that don't have anything but a big box store for the most household items that you might purchase. A lot of rural communities have kind of gotten screwed. They've been forced to accept Walmarts and Targets as stores in their area for less than market value on taxes, and they have provide the principal employment to the town and most of its goods and services at that point. These are places that are incredibly dependent on these big box mart stores that are going to see an increase in price. They're not going to raise their wages. Yeah, they're not going to raise their wages. They're not going to make it easier for people to buy things. People are going to hit hard times if these tariffs go forward. And these are, and then there's a certain amount of Schadenfreude, I suppose, in that it is Trump supporters who will probably get hurt the worst, but we will get hit too. Prices of things have already been high from inflation over the past few years, kind of, sort of. There was a huge inflationary pressure that occurred in 2020 due to a lot of shipment disruptions from COVID. Uh, it's during the election, a lot of people, Elon Musk in particular, tried to push the lie that inflation is caused solely by the overproduction and overprinting of currency. The reality is that inflation is a pretty complex topic. It is at various times been caused by changes in supply or demand. More usually, the supply is not capable of meeting the demand. This is a pretty common problem. It's what caused a lot of the inflation in 20. But the supply situation eventually evened itself out. It took a while, particularly for certain goods. For example, like my uncle had to get something fixed on his car that required a computer chip to be replaced. It took months for that computer chip part to be in, even in 2023. There was a bit of lag to that, and that did cause increased prices. There was simply not the supply to meet the necessary demand around much of the world due to these disruptions. However, there is also a certain degree of profiteering going on in major corporations who, despite this, enjoyed record profits, which I would remind you, if you haven't taken business class, where they consider the concept of expenses, uh, income minus expense to equal profit, as a revelation, groundbreaking stuff, is the difference between their increased expenses and how much money they've made. The simple fact is, the Republican Party is taking us down an economic path that has been tried and rejected centuries ago. It is true that the United States did not have an income tax for much of its early existence. We funded a significant portion of federal activity through tariffs, principally on the Port of New York. I think by the 1860s, it was something like 60% of all federal funding came from tariffs on goods that came into New York. The the reality of this is that this was a bad system. One of the keystone arguments being made by the early progressive movement in the United States was that tariffs are a much more onerous tax on people who are poorer and the rising middle class at the time. It's also important to note that a lot of companies have been stockpiling goods leading up to these tariffs. Yeah, but I suspect that you will see those companies that are stockpiling goods raising the prices preemptively to make profit prior to the tariff. The overwhelming desire of business is to have line go up, regardless of the cost of what making the line going up actually means. This is obviously a problem. It is I would argue, an anti-human activity. It makes our ability to function as a species much more precarious. It makes it much more difficult to make necessary changes to structural and economic systems, and it engages a lot of the worst impulses of people. Greed being one of them, and the "I've got mine, fuck you" attitude that has become so pervasive in our society and culture. The the ultimate point of this particular adventure that Trump is engaging in this trade war, it's not going to be good for the people that we are imposing the tariffs on. It's not going to be good for us. It will, however, create more hardship. It will create a particular sense of despair for a lot of people. And this is principally what Trump was able to successfully run on twice. There is a certain level in the MAGA movement of perverse incentive. They talk a huge game about making America great again, obviously. It's the core of their identity. But there's no real incentive to do so, because if America is great, there's no need for people like Trump. At least in their mind. They see a connection between continued conflict and isolationism and the nature of their power base. And I can understand a certain level of apprehension that you have, that everyone has. But the thing I want to point out is that this is not truly sustainable. We are much more integrated as a global economy than we ever were in the late 1700s when this started to fall out of favor. A lot of people, like, I've seen a lot of arguments from Republicans about things like, oh, people are upset. I want to preserve American lives. You want cheap tomatoes. The fact is that American lives eat cheap imported tomatoes. You cannot, there is not really, like the concept of nations has kind of, to a certain extent, become diluted. There is a certain end to what a nation is able to provide itself. Self-sufficiency is not a national capability in this day and age. The concept of a trade war is so, like, fear-inducing for people because it is kind of economic apocalypse. It benefits no one. There is no gain that comes from this. It will not advance Trump's drug policies because that, first of all, their drug policy is ridiculous. But second of all, it doesn't induce cooperation. Like, the pain isn't felt by the Canadians principally. It's going to be felt by Americans. Canadians will feel their own pain. Mexicans will feel their own pain. But they won't feel that in relation to us. There's no incentive to work together here. More to the point, the United States has widely issued these tariffs. They've issued them to basically all of Europe. Not all, but pretty much all. China, one of the biggest exporters of goods in the world. Mexico and Canada, two of our closest trading partners. Canada and Mexico do not have tariffs on one another. China isn't going to have those tariffs with places like the EU, Canada, and Mexico. The United States has issued such a massive web of tariffs that it's functionally freezing itself out of its capability to influence the global economy. That is, in a certain level, somewhat fatal to our ability to exercise soft power in the near future. You really are kind of seeing, like, economic what's the word, self-harm playing out on a global scale on the part of Donald Trump. It is definitionally a kind of break from conservatism into the pure regressive reactionary politics. And I think that's as good a segue as any to our next topic for tonight. Let us make me smaller. Look who it is! It's everyone's favorite lunatic, Brianna Wu. few days ago, Brianna Wu issued this particular tweet. And forgive me, I've been having to look at this for several minutes now, and her face is starting to freak me the fuck out. Brianna Wu, we had a paradise. There was literally no civilization in history where it was better to be trans. Access to healthcare was better than we ever could have imagined. And in 10 years, the progressive fringe took it so far, now the Republicans are dismantling it all and normal people are cheering him. This is an interesting take. And by interesting, I mean it's dumb. Civil rights are a tricky topic to talk about in American history by virtue of the fact that we have a period of American history that we distinctly call the Civil Rights Movement. And the Civil Rights Movement has a beginning and end as far as narrativization goes. It kind of can leave someone who is not historically literate the impression that civil rights is a done issue. And this isn't really how it works. So before I get into this in detail, I want to preface this with saying the fundamental understanding that we have to take away about civil rights is a basic unfairness. It seems self-evident to a lot of us that civil rights are a natural thing that we should grant onto people if we want to enjoy them ourselves. It seems unfair that people should be denied those things. The trick of this is that civil rights has always, in American history and other places, to be absolutely clear, been a situation that is not static. Rights are granted, they are enumerated, they are pushed for, they are advocated for routinely, and they are routinely pushed back. There is always the preface that you may lose those rights, because ultimately, irrespective of whatever kind of rhetoric you attach to the concept of rights, for example, some people say rights are ordained by God and therefore they cannot be altered. And that's dumb, because rights are clearly granted by people and they can be very, very functionally altered all the time. Whatever rhetoric you attach to rights, these are relationships and transactions between people. The reality is, quite simply, that civil rights are a battle. And they are a battle that is won in excruciating pain for those to whom it matters the most. And I think to illustrate this, we should probably bring up a particular point. Kind of one of the landmark parts of American history, as far as the civil rights movement is concerned, is the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is a significant portion of American jurisprudence. It is considered one of the most consequential legislative achievements in American history. It's also curious that it's called the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and was when it was created as such. And there's a reason for that. There have been civil rights acts in the past. As a matter of fact, the first one was issued shortly after the end of the American Civil War. It's the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And its objective is to codify things like citizenship and who is bound by American law. It does functionally a lot of the things that the 14th Amendment ended up doing, and that's important to this story. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was passed by Congress in the wake of the end of the Civil War and ultimately vetoed by Lincoln's vice president, then turned president. They then turned around, passed it again, and it was vetoed again. And ultimately, it was that veto was overridden. The law was, at the time of its passage, largely considered unenforceable. The argument was that the Constitution did not give Congress the authority necessary to rule that someone was or was not a citizen of the country. Broadly speaking, the consideration was that the states could decide who was a citizen of the state, and that in turn granted the person a citizenship for the United States more generally. This is resolved ultimately by the passage of the 14th Amendment and its first clause. This is the amendment in particular is kind of designed to dilute the power of the states to deny someone citizenship. And it's very telling that is another thing that Trump has taken aim at to try to undermine American people is the birthright citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment, which we talked about last time. The other half of this particular discussion is that this pretty rapidly in the period in the Reconstruction period post following the Civil War dramatically changes the political landscape for the South. Suddenly you have a whole bunch of recently freed enslaved people who have the right to vote, have the right to run for office, and have a political party that granted all of them that, and in turn has endeared them to the loyalty of that population. Huge number of African Americans were elected to positions in the South after the fall of the Confederacy. This in turn saw substantial pushback from the entrenched interests in the South of the former slaveholders and many of the transient and smaller white farmers. To the point that Nathan Bedford Forrest decided to form the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist organization which had at its inception the purpose of terrorizing blacks into not engaging in political advocacy on their own. So you see already this dynamic at the very beginning of what can be considered broadly the American civil rights movement, of this kind of push-pull dynamic, that the advocacy for rights in even the most minor format starts to engender pushback from entrenched people who do not desire to see other people gain rights. This is a fairly constant engagement. And the story of civil rights in America is at least from that point on, this story of battle between these people who are pushing forward to try to gain new recognition for themselves as people and gain their humanity in the eyes of the law, and people who are bitterly opposed to this. And this is constant. There's this kind of weird idea that some historically illiterate people have, that history is a progression of better and better events. And this is, on a certain level, understandable, because outcomes from people living today are in many ways substantively better than they were for people living in the past. But inside this dichotomy and in this example is the fact that securing these outcomes requires sacrifice and suffering on the parts of many people who are historically oppressed to begin with, and who are historically have to work much harder to have their voices heard. So when Brianna Wu says this, when Brianna Wu paints the past as a paradise, I find that naive at best. Um, I'm reminded of a older television show that I absolutely love, and I'm sure this will surprise no one. Night Court, late '80s, early '90s. Night Court, not the reboot, which I haven't really watched much of because it's not the same. Night Court has a particular episode. I'm almost positive the episode is called Dan's Friend, and John Larroquette is one of the actors who had a long run. on Night Court. But the principle of this episode is that Dan Fielding, John Larroquette's character, who is the prosecutor, is having his best friend is coming to town to get prior to getting married. His best friend, his name was Chip, and Chip is a when he arrives, beautiful woman. Turns out that Chip gotten a gender reassignment surgery. They had transitioned. The episode focuses on John Larroquette's frankly transphobic. Uh, to be fair, transphobic feelings concerning his former friend, and they reconcile by the end of 30 minutes. It's the 80s. Um, and to be fair, if you go and watch the episode, a lot of the characters who accept her are also a little transphobic. But again, it's the 80s. I don't know if I would call that a paradise. Because if you think about this particular depiction of this woman's experience, she goes to her friend and she is shunned, and she is told that she is a freak, and she is told that she is wrong. And I don't know if I'd call that a paradise. And Brianna Wu's position that the fact that people are pushing for it, new rights and new recognitions, and care that they need, and care that is vital to them, has caused a harm to the trans movement is ahistorical. Guess what? If no one had said a goddamn word about being trans, they still would have done this. They still would be violently transphobic towards trans people. It was never about what you pushed for. It was never about what bathroom you went into. It was always about making people afraid. It was always about making people afraid of a little group that wields in fairly insubstantial power. And I want to find this. I should have found this earlier. There is a chart which details how many, the perception that people have, how large certain minorities groups are, and how large they actually are. Is it? Nope, that's not it. I cannot find that chart. Well done. Here we go. Found it. YouGov America. Good job. Save that. Open that. I apologize for the dead air. Stay with me. Stay with me. This is why you prep shows ahead of time, people, because I'm bad at. Finding things. I literally just had it. All right, let's zoom in a little bit here. Woo! Too much, too much. I know you've touched on gun issue in the past. I've heard that David Hogg became a DNC vice chair. I think gun policy should be reassessed for the midterms. I think, broadly speaking, the Democratic Party should probably focus on things that aren't divisive, like economics, because Trump is leaving them a massive opening. This is a really telling chart. It's a difference between the estimated uh, size of particular cohorts of American society versus their actuals. So, for example, the proportion of Americans who have a household income over 1 million is less than 1%. People think it's at 20%. And all along here, you can see quite clearly that a lot of these groups that we assign an awful lot of societal power to when it comes time to vote our fears are really fucking small. For example, Americans think broadly that there are 27% of the population is Muslim. Less than 1%. 30% of the population is Jewish. It's 2%. Are gay or lesbian? 3%. And they think it's 30%. And this is, I think, part of the principal problem, at least in terms of Brianna Wu's position. People are going to think that a significant portion of the population is trans. The reality is that they are not. There are very few trans people. It is not a huge cohort. And this presents a lot of problems for you if you're a trans advocate, right? The objective that you kind of have to work around is you have to secure mass support in order to advance yourself and your position in civil rights. And like we're talking about the civil rights movement and the Civil Rights Act of 1864, for example, 12% of the population is black, and people think it's nearly half, 41. Are transgender people think 20%? But yes, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I know there are a couple trans activists here in our audience, such as Stephanie tonight. But I'm pretty sure the actual number is less than 1% of the population is trans. Like, I don't think it's a large cohort at all. It might be like 1.1, 1.2. It's not big. And like, that's obviously a lot of people when you put it into the factor of a 350 million person population. That's not insignificant. Those are real people with real stories. But as a political cohort and as a group, it's very small, and it's very difficult for them there to merely be able to advocate for themselves on their own. The trans movement is dependent, at least in part, on the ability to rally support beyond itself. And what Brianna Wu is doing is she is making that impossible. I want to point out that Brianna Wu is a transgender individual who was closeted for many years. Like, not in reality, like everybody knew. It was like a transparent fucking closet. But she herself did not admit that um she was very content not to participate in this discussion. Her principal grift was, I am a woman, and I'm a woman in tech, and etc., etc., etc. And now her new grift is, I am an ally of Jews, although that she's kind of hilariously inept at. and I am a normal trans person, and that in itself is pretty fucking offensive. Her position is basically, if you are not conform, if you don't desire to conform to gender roles, then you are not a normal trans person and a threat to the trans movement. And this is obviously an ahistorical understanding of how the rights of people are advanced. The rights of people require advocacy. They require full-throated advocacy. Because guess what? More often than not, people are letting loose dogs on you and fucking fire hoses. And sometimes they're goddamn lynching you. So I want to point out that this is an incredibly privileged woman who hasn't had to deal with any of that, who successfully managed to take herself and pass, to be frank, for years. And she's now in a position where she has the ability to advocate on behalf of people who need help, people who have experienced struggles similar to her own. And she's so filled with self-loathing and hatred for herself that she projects onto everyone around her that she's doing this. Oh God, I keep looking at that fucking profile picture, and you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of that meme the kids had a couple years back, Momo, where that had that freaky thing. The Momo meme challenge hoax, yeah. What was it? Just a fucking uncanny. Jesus. And honest to God, I don't give a fuck what she looks like, but that's creepy as shit. Like, come on. Uh, that's just a horrible angle. Do something. Get a photographer to help. And stop using the fucking filter. Momo was a Japanese art piece, and for some reason, if you got sent Momo on a WhatsApp, you'd die like the Ring tapes. I'm so glad. I'm just so glad that half this shit goes over my head. But she has such an uncanny valley look to her now. Jesus Christ. It's really the filter at the end of the day. Like, she claims she doesn't use a filter, but she very clearly is. And, like, you use a filter, big deal. I use a filter on my little profile pic down here. Come on. Why? Because I'm sick and I look like crap. I used to almost pass for hot once. It was sad. Our standards are low in the millennial cohort. But I tell you what, we are not wired to view sick people as hot, and kidney disease is sick people. And like another really interesting thing is if we consider the Civil Rights Act of 1864, um, the next one is the Civil Rights Act of, or excuse me, 1964. The next one is the Civil Rights Act of 1968. This one, very notably, is passed in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination. And that's a kind of an oversimplification. It was passed in response to the mass fucking riots that took place after Martin Luther King's assassination. Um, Unpopular opinion for basic bitches like Wick time. Sometimes, to make an omelet, you have to break a fuck ton of eggs. Although not right now, because eggs are like $1 a fucking piece, and you can't find them. But when eggs are more plentiful again, maybe consider breaking some in order to advance civil rights. Yeah, I was at dialysis talking with some people, and we were all talking about the lack of availability of eggs, and we all considered for a moment entering an egg disability commune. We're going to combine our resources together in order to have an egg every once in a while. And more to the point, there are civil rights acts that take place afterwards, securing things like fair housing. Civil rights is always going to be a thing that has to be advocated for. And people who decide that the advocacy for the increase and advancement of civil rights is itself the problem that causes the contraction of civil rights are people that you should not listen to. Why? Because they are people who are not interested in the advancement of civil rights. They are the people who, like I said before, have adopted this attitude of I've got mine, fuck you. And Brianna Wu's focus, extensive focus, on the concept of normalcy is a very telling indication of this. Like she in turn prides herself for striving towards normalcy, quote unquote, and seems to hate herself for not being able to fully adopt it. And this translates into her grift. And while we're here, we might as well talk about her advocacy around Israel. Because I swear to God, she's probably doing more to make Israel less popular than any American alive. Brianna Wu has decided that she is some great friend of Zionists and, by extension, Jews, which already is pretty fucking anti-Semitic, because it assumes that Zionism is representative of the desires and wishes of all Jews. And that clearly is not the case. And you need only ask many Jews who are considered to be less Jewish by their Zionist cohort, when they do not wish to advocate on behalf of the unlimited right of Israel to kill people and steal land, and instead choose to say, no, not in my name. And they are somehow considered to be less Jewish for it. That in and of itself is remarkably tone deaf, but like a distinction that I guess rides in a very fine line for people, because I probably, if this stream ever got significantly wider uptake, I probably would get tagged by some Zionists as anti-Semitic for saying that. I have been tagged as Zionists for anti-Semitic as saying that, because they're slanderous fools. But the other part of this is her kind of like adoption of these ideas. So she's talking about some of Zionism's founders and like the effect that the Dreyfus Affair has on beginning to push Europeans into Zionism. And she does this whole tweet that she cribs off of Wikipedia because it's virtually word for word off of Wikipedia, except for the spelling of Dreyfus, which she misspells repeatedly. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. And I just sat there. And like, it's a subtle enough misspelling that it kind of flipped a switch in my brain. I had to think about it for a minute. Like, this doesn't look right. It's kind of, again, it's like looking at Brianna Wu's profile picture. Something is uncannily wrong with this. So I went and I checked. Did she compare transits to Dreyfus? Not directly. She's doing two different grifts right now. She's doing the Yam Israel Chai grift, and she's doing the I am the normal trans person who is reasonable and right wing coded for everyone grift. But anyway, she misspells Dreyfus. And I go and I look again. And Brianna Wu has gotten tired of me making her look like an idiot, so she's blocked me on Twitter. So I would quote, tweet, and correct her repeatedly. She does this a lot. To a lot of people who are capable of correcting her. Her strategy in life is to make sure that she never engages with anyone smarter than her, which is gradually limiting the pool of people with whom she may engage. Because, frankly, you're not clearing a high bar if you say you're smarter than Brianna Wu. Anyway, the other big one that I find hilarious is the saying "Yam Israel Chai," and it's a Russian origin saying. Not strictly speaking Zionist, but eventually was adopted and she misspelled it. as Yam, Y-A-M, Israel, Chai, as in the T, C-H-A-I. Correct spelling, A-M, Israel, Y-I-S-R-A-L, Chai, C-H-A-I. It's a slogan of Jewish solidarity. And she just goes, damn. And so Brianna Wu and her acolytes like Wick have big feelings about people who should be allowed to participate in left and liberal coalitions. Guess what? Most of us are not worthy, according to Brianna. And I think it's kind of incumbent on exposing someone like this whenever possible as the ignorant, transphobic, anti-Semitic asshole that they are. Because this is the kind of person, her essential argument is that the Democratic Party needs to do what it's done in the past, but harder. If only we could just be a little bit more heartily democratic, then it will work. So, really, when you get down to it, this is the kind of person that needs to be challenged at every opportunity. This is the kind of person like that needs to be called out when they say things like this. When they threaten the ability of people who need help to get help. And they threaten the ability of people who need help to advocate for themselves, to be able to stand up and say, I am a person worthy of being treated with respect and dignity. And if she's going to be as brazenly self-serving as to suggest that someone who is doing this, who is standing up and saying that I am a person who deserves to be treated with self-respect and dignity, that they are a threat to her, then we need to seriously evaluate whether or not she should participate in public life. Brianna Wu has money. She could fuck right off into obscurity, enjoy herself, not threatened by people who, simply want to exist. We don't need you. You are not useful. You are not wanted. And we know that you're not wanted because despite your constant claims that there's all these people who are secretly agreeing with you, that can't be said to do so publicly, as if that's how politics works, because we know it's not. You build coalitions, people who are willing to stand next to you and say, I support what this person believes in, and I will work with them to bring it to fruition. The reality is, these people aren't real. They're your girlfriend who lives in Canada. You are not wanted, not needed. You can walk away anytime you want. You do not need to participate. You do not need to bring harm to the people that you pretend to advocate for. Sorry, I got a little mad there for a second. We're good. We're good. I think we should bounce into the last segment today.
So I know it's been 2025.
It's stealing Adam's content time. All right. I think this is a good opportunity to talk about some things here. If you're not familiar with Adam Conover, he is a college humor, former college humor writer and actor, and I guess it's called Dropout now. Uh, who launched himself onto his pretty successful TV show, at least for cable, called Adam Ruins Everything. And in it, he kind of works to attack misinformation that's sitting in the political water supply. And I guess Adam's doing everything is not really a thing anymore, and he's kind of principally engaged in stand-up. But for what it's worth, he does YouTube videos every once in a while that are somewhat entertaining or thought-provoking. I watched this one last night, and I have thoughts. We should get into that. But first, let's go take a blood clot break and take a little walk, grab some water, take your medicine if you need to. Be back in about 5. Look, it's my show. I should be a little bit bigger. All right, welcome back. Let's move on. So in this video, Adam is going to talk about how we kind of talk about time. Sort of, kind of. And we're not going to watch the whole thing. It's 16 minutes long, and I have extensive thoughts to give, so buckle up. And more specifically, how we kind of just lost the concept of the decade as a understanding of what the zeitgeist is. That's my kind of wording, not his. And I think it's an interesting thought that we should probably, devil's toothpaste, yummy, that we should probably think about. And there are some broader thoughts to bring into this too. So let's go.
5 for a month now, but doesn't it kind of feel like we've all been trapped in the same year forever? Like time has been barely passing at all? I mean, the pandemic feels like it was yesterday, but doesn't it also feel like it was 100 years ago? And how are we already up to Sonic the Hedgehog 3? I don't even remember Sonic the Hedgehog 2. It feels like 2 weeks ago. What the hell? 2004, it does feel like time is
I confessedly care not at all about Sonic the Hedgehog movies.
Moving a lot faster. And it's not just because you're a teeny little guy. So I've put a lot of thought into this, and I have a theory. I think it's because in the last 25 years, our culture has quietly experienced a huge linguistic shift that no one is talking about, but that has literally changed how we experience and remember the passage of time, and alienated us from each other and our own culture, all because the words we use to talk about time have changed. But before I explain, let me just remind you that I'm on tour right now with a brand new, you might call it
Adam Conover's on tour. If you want to know, we don't care.
The post-pandemic era, or maybe the second Trump administration. Or, as I overheard someone say in LA recently, you might say we're entering our fire era.
Actually, I just go, I hope everything works out okay.
Bleak. But you know, we used to have a different way to talk about the passage of time that was pervasive in our society. Up until about 20 years ago, we described the passage of time purely in 10-year chunks called decades. Remember those? The roaring 20s, the swinging 60s, and the no soup for you 90s. You know, it's difficult to overstate how much we structured our entire culture around these specific 10-year chunks, but I don't have to state it at all.
So, like, right off the bat, I kind of want to point out a piddly pedantic thing. And I presume if you're here, you want to hear me be pedantic. It's not that we structured our understanding. It's we structured our collective memory around that. Obviously, not everyone was running around with bell bottoms in the 70s, and not everyone was running around wearing the particular t-shirt and jeans fashions of the 90s, and et cetera, et cetera. This is kind of our collective understanding and cultural touchstone for that era. It does not mean that it's pervasive in all things, but it is pervasive enough that it can be reliably counted upon to be in your collective idea of what it is. So, for example, not everyone is running around being a flapper in the 1980s. But if I want to communicate to you, for example, visually in a film, that it is the 20s, I'm probably going to reach for that kind of imagery. Or if I want to write a story in the 20s, you're going to reach for that kind of imagery. It doesn't necessarily capture the breadth of human experience for the decade. So I think kind of understanding the relationship here is a little off. What we're really talking about when we talk about the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, in particular in the United States, and the 19 variation of that, is we're kind of talking about tropes and our comfort of being able to express ourselves through a trope. And the nature of how we relate to one another through our shared understanding of tropes.
because you know it already intuitively. If I were to tell you to close your eyes and picture the 70s, you'd instantly think bell bottoms, big lapels, and John Travolta staying alive. If I asked you what the 40s sounded like, you can hear a big swing band in your mind. And if I say the word 90s, you can practically see the Saved by the Bell intro, feel the snap bracelet around your wrist, taste the Arch Deluxe, hear Blur's Song 2, and smell the sickly.
Despite the fact that most of my childhood took place in the 90s, I never got to try the Arch Deluxe.
Sweet aroma of Bed Bath & Beyond. The bundle of concepts associated with each decade feels so distinct and meaningful that just the name of a decade evokes a world of associations with that time period. And up until the late 90s, we used these decade names almost constantly in everyday speech to describe not just the past, but the present.
Wake up and smell the 90s.
Come on, Uncle Phil, this is the 90s, man.
Man, it's the 90s. It's hammer time. Come on.
I can be anything I want to be. It's the 90s.
Honey, it's the 90s, remember?
The Arch Deluxe is a canceled McDonald's sandwich that actually turned out to be well-liked, but not widely popular.
Chips, microwaves, faxes, air
It's kind of a McDonald's meme now.
phones.
For God's sake, Chucky, drag yourself into the 90s.
I mean, the 90s were such an enormous, omnipresent concept that even sentient axe-murdering dolls understood they had to get with the times. The phrase was a...
Welcome, Bad Science Sunday viewers. Nice to see you. Pull up a chair. Like the stream. Subscribe if you aren't. Hey, Maya. Thanks. Appreciate you.
cultural shorthand for this pervasive feeling that the world was new and advancing and that the old norms of the past were being swept away. The passage from the 80s to the 90s was seen as this literal cultural vibe shift. But then,
there's a really interesting thing about the 80s too. So I'm a late 80s baby, obviously, being, you know, in my mid 30s. I've heard people describe the 80s as two parts: the drab brown 80s and the neon 80s. The neon 80s being the later half. So like I would be described as a neon 80s baby.
10 years later, something happened that made the vibes suddenly stop shifting. See, in English, we have words for the numbers from 20 to 29, 30 through 39, all
right, I'm going to stop you right here again, Adam. Sorry. This is not incorrect. Obviously, we don't have a commonly accepted shorthand for the period of years from, 2000 to 2009, 2010. We do, however, have a commonly accepted shorthand for 2010 to 2020, and it's the teens. Like, for example, I use the phrase early aughts, and for that kind of period of like reaching back to the beginning of the War on Terror. And I really think broadly, when we talk about the American zeitgeist, that we should not discount the fact that September 11th was in 2001. And this is kind of, this is like the thing. This dramatically shifts Americans' feelings about the trajectory of the country. Hey, Maya. And like, there's a change. It's a vibe change. There is a war. We are in wars. There's this kind of, this very different idea that comes forward that's not solely to do with the lack of a word. And Adam is going to go on to talk about the nature of how we think about language and speak languages and how that affects how we perceive things. And this is valid, but this is not something that we can take in isolation without understanding the wider effects of actual events that happen to us and how these things communicate. Like, you kind of like, it's impossible to argue that your outlook wasn't shifted dramatically by how viscerally real 9/11 brought terror home to us in a very real way. How vulnerable it made us, and how angry that vulnerability made us, and how aggressive it made us. And that's different than the 90s. The 90s kind of have this air of victory about them, if you think about it. The Soviet Union collapses. The American army and the American coalition utterly crushes the Iraqi army. It's a kind of a decade of triumphalism. And this is very rudely interrupted by Osama bin Laden. And so, like, that is a pretty substantive event, I think, in how we look at and engage with our understanding of the era we live in.
The way up through 90 to 99, 20s, 30s, 40s, etc. But we don't actually have a word for the two groups of numbers that precede them, 0 through 9 and 10 through 19. So when the clock turned from December 31st, 1999 to January 1st, 2000, and we all realized the Y2K bug wasn't actually going to kill us, we found ourselves in a new decade that we just didn't have a good name for. Now, if you were around at the time, you might remember that a lot of energy was spent proposing names for the decade. Some literal proposals were the aughts, the double zeros, and even the naughties. That last one probably didn't catch on because it wasn't exactly a naughty time. America was so conservative in those days, people were literally wearing dresses over pants. And the others made you either sound like Grandpa Simpson or just felt bad coming out of your mouth. They didn't match how we use the English language in everyday life. So instead of settling on any of those names, we just started calling the decade nothing. We didn't say, welcome to the Audis. We didn't say, welcome to the anything. We all just stopped talking about the decade. And
that's because we're all terrified of getting, called out for being too friendly. Maybe it's just a Chicago thing. But in Chicago, we tend to mind our own goddamn business. So we don't go, welcome to the Audis. We just keep on fucking walking.
Entirely. Then, 10 years later, once we entered the 2010s, once again, we simply could not find a good name to use. I mean, sure, 2013 through 2019 could technically be called the teens, but not 2010, 11, or 12. And the 2010s doesn't exactly...
Yeah, that's a little pedantic even for me.
Roll off the tongue. Neither does the early 2000s. It's missing that bouncy 80s, 90s, 70s quality. It's just not fucking fun to say, so we didn't say it that much, meaning that once again, the decade went by without it ever receiving a widespread popular name. But then, at long last, 5 years ago, it became 2020. Finally, a year with a good decade name. But by then, it had been so long since we talked in decades, the muscle had atrophied, and we just never started doing it. I mean,
I can certainly see the point he's making, but I don't think that's it. And this is a particular observation I'm going to bring as someone who studies history. The problem isn't that we didn't call the teens and the aughts the aughts. The problem is that the 20s is now associated with the trope of the 1920s. Ditto for the 30s, etc. Onward and onward. And this is, I think, an interesting thing, because when I want to talk about an event in 1820, for example, the 1820 Great Compromise, the Missouri Compromise, I don't say, well, in the 20s, because that will, as a listener, cue you into the 1920s and not cue you in to the fact that I'm talking about the 1820s unless I explain myself more. The decades themselves as an expression of a collective understanding of time and experiences during those times have been somewhat reserved by the last century. And this is obviously a problem because the way that years are labeled in 100-year increments causes them to kind of cycle through. So we don't think about the 30s as the 1830s or the 1730s, despite the fact that there are historically significant events in those periods. The concept of tropes is kind of what he's missing here, and how tropes come to be defined and commonly accepted. And that, I think, does a lot more to explain why we don't do that, because it's not useful to call the 2020s the 20s when it invokes the 1920s. So, like, we've missed one of the principal points. And I'm going to skip ahead a bit.
We are literally F. Scott Fitzgerald. Describe in from 2012. What would you wear? A trucker hat, a collared shirt, the concept of Barack Obama? Fashion doesn't really feel like it's changed as much in the past 20 years. I mean, look at the clothes from The Office. Sure, the colors are a little dorky maybe, but if you wore them today, you wouldn't look like you stepped out of a time machine. But in the late 90s, okay, just 13 years earlier, exactly would be different. I mean,
this is several minutes of Adam not really being able to explain tropes.
Taylor Swift was still on the radio. Suits for Women were in.
And long may Taylor Swift reign. Haters gonna hate. Guess
what? They still are. Our iPhones today are a little big about the affordable. Our sponsor, Ground News, and you'll see that we are still are. Our iPhone, if they made a movie today about 13 years ago, what exactly would be different? I mean, Taylor Swift was still on.
And I'll be honest, that's not really true. So I mentioned earlier, I've been watching The Good Wife, which is a topical show of the aughts, to be sophisticated about it. The Good Wife is very evocative of that period of time in American politics. You very much feel the nature of the times, the Barack Obama age and the discussions that happened around that in particular. And that's pegged to the persons involved more than it is to any particular sense of trope, but it is like recognizable. And I'll let Adam get on
the radio. Suits for Women were in. Guess what? They still are. Our iPhones today are a little bigger. Who gives a shit? And in 2012, gas prices were rising and politicians were arguing about the Affordable Care Act.
This is not a concept of our inability to quantify time in the same way. This is very much a concept of the nature of discourse in the United States now. And I think this is really topical in this particular discussion because the whole point of Adam Ruins Everything is the use of Adam as a stool pigeon to talk about common misconceptions in the water supply of discourse. So we have this concept of the marketplace of ideas. And you find a lot of people sort of advocating for this. And like, it's a weird concept on a lot of levels, but as a metaphor, it breaks down very quickly. The idea of a marketplace is that you go into the marketplace and you browse amongst the available goods and you select your favorites, the best. And that, for example, if the marketplace is a farmer's market, if the produce is bad, it gets removed. The trouble with this analogy is really clear when you start to understand how misinformation spreads and stays relevant. And this is relevant to a lot of things we've been talking about in these communities lately. A lie has utility for those who are lying. And as a matter of fact, there is no mechanism to remove the lie from the greater water supply of our discourse. So the lie can be repeated ad nauseum and to different audiences and become pervasive. And the only thing that really kills a lie in discourse is that that lie is no longer efficacious for the advancement of the liar's cause, at which point they will more than likely have moved on to a new lie. And that is the trouble with lies and telling them about people. You will never be able to excise lies out of discourse. Not really. You can push back against them. They'll be pervasive for those who wish to tell them, for those to whom they are convenient. Yeah, I like how everyone is naming very, very significant portions of things that changed over the aughts. Smartphones weren't in common usage till about 2010, 2011, 2012. They were kind of a luxury, high-class luxury item until then. They're still expensive as shit, don't get me wrong, but they're considered a kind of necessity now for most people. Back on my point, though. It is advantageous to continue to lie about the Affordable Care Act. It's advantageous to continue to talk about gas prices. These things persist despite the lack of, like For example, the talk about inflation. Inflation has gone down. This lie persists because it is useful and profitable. Yes. There is no true marketplace of ideas. There is no mechanism by which that marketplace is regulated, even on the most basic level. Like if you're a farmer at a farmer's market, it behooves you not to have rotten produce, but it does not behoove you to remove a lie from the marketplace of ideas, because you never need to be accountable to that. You can tell it over and over and over again to whoever will listen. And the energy that it takes to debunk that lie is always more than the energy it took to create the lie. So here is the understanding that we have to take. Much like when I said about civil rights, we must always keep pushing forward against misinformation, against lies, against slander. We must always keep pushing forward because there's no way to protect yourself. There's no way to just make it stop except to stand up each and every time and say no. And that's exhausting, but it is the reality.
The same shit we're arguing about, GOP is part of all of or
Ground News isn't paying me, so we're not listening to the sponsorship.
made our culture stop evolving. Obviously, it has continued to. But because the decade names functioned as a way to socially agree on what had changed and as a shorthand way to describe what those changes looked like, losing them has interfered with our ability to communicate and therefore identify what has changed over the passage of time. And
No, it hasn't. There's nuances to that, but it requires a nuanced conversation about regulation of the public sphere. Yeah, you're not going to get that nuanced conversation anytime soon. It's pretty much a screaming match, and it's designed to be a screaming match because the lie is the objective.
English speakers' ability to describe smells was compared to people who speak Jahai, a language spoken by hunter-gatherers living on the border of Malaysia and Thailand. Now, unlike English, Jahai has lots of unique, specific words for different kinds of smells and the sense impressions that they make. And during the study, people who spoke Jahai were able to name and identify new smells they had never encountered before much more quickly than English speakers.
This is actually not a relatively new observation, by the way. It's a bad episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. It's actually one of the worst. It is the episode where Worf and Jadzia go to Risa to vacation, and they bring along Quark for some reason. And Worf decides to join a group of eco-terrorists and turn off the weather modification systems for Risa, causing it to rain uncontrollably. Quark as a Ferengi goes, we have 23 different words for rain. Right now it's glebening. This is not a new observation.
There's evidence that this function of language extends to time too. Mind for the past. That means that their concept of time is languages. And when we're talking about decades, we're talking about a difference within the English language. But this does seem like a relevant analogy and study to me because we're beginning to understand that the words we have available to us to describe the world around us do help shape the way we understand and think about the world.
This is an observation that has been made in epistemology for generations, by the way.
And that's in everyday speech, generations. In the last 20 years, generational language and concepts have exploded in popular culture. And as far as I can tell, that has replaced decades in the cultural imagination. For instance, when we talk about fashion for the past 20 years, we don't talk about Audie's fashion. Instead, we call it millennial fashion and Gen Z fashion. And I think that's a problem because look, I've been a critic of the concept of generations for years. My very first YouTube video on this channel was about how generations don't exist. They are a marketing invention. But you know what? Over time, I've come to accept that generations can be a useful shorthand for talking about the differences between different age cohorts, just like decades are the same thing for time periods. But here's the problem. We're using generational language to describe things that have nothing to do with what year you were born at all. For instance, let's talk.
Well, hang on just a hot minute. The point that he is going to make here is that we use these to be tribalistic. However, we used decades to do that too. I'll admit, this difference between millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha and all that shit is annoying, and I get irritated when my younger viewers call me a boomer. But this is not new. This is a different manifestation of the thing we already did. How protective do you know 90s kids are of being a 90s kid? I was born in 1993. Fuck you. You weren't cognizant for most of the 90s. 80s, same. I sometimes don't get included in the 80s cohort because of the number of years left after I was born and how much was not left of the 80s. This is not a new thing. And this is kind of where we're going to leave it. The generation discussion is annoying. Our generation's like fixed cohorts? No, but they are anthropologically useful, I think, on a certain level. As long as you don't extend out the metaphor too far. So yeah, good start. Needs some work. You got to refine this process, Adam. I'll give you a C and let you revise it. And with that, I want to bid you all a very, very happy night. It's getting nicer out, at least by me. Go enjoy some of the little better weather that we seem to be having across the country. Take a walk. Make a friend. Touch some grass. It's that kind of week. Thank you for tuning in. Ta-ta.